Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks, my name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today in the kitchen we are making French onion soup. And I have a video on a French onion soup recipe that is a pressure canned recipe. And so if you're interested in that, you can look that up. I'll leave a link to the description below. This one is slightly different. My recipe is based off of one from America's Test Kitchen. And they have two main French onion soup recipes, and I've made the other one quite a bit. This one tweaks things a little bit, and the biggest change is that for the first 20 minutes of cooking the onions, you actually cook them with the lid on, and this causes the onions to sweat out all of their moisture so that things caramelize and break down a little bit faster than they would if you just did it with the lid off the entire time. So that's the primary change between this recipe and the original America's Test Kitchen recipe that I've used for years. I actually do think the flavors on the original recipe are maybe slightly better, although French onion soup in general is just fantastic. A nice, good quality beef broth makes a huge difference. So if you've got some good home canned beef broth, or use some better than bouillon, which is quite good, and then some melty, ooey gooey cheese, and you can go as expensive or as inexpensive as you want on that. Traditionally, Gruyère and Parmesan are what's typically used, at least Gruyère for sure. And Gruyère is just a fancy way of saying a type of Swiss cheese. And so if you've never purchased that, you can look for it in the specialty cases at your big box grocery stores. They will typically have it, but any kind of high quality Swiss cheese will work. Or as you'll see at the end of this video, even a simple sliced Swiss cheese from the deli case also works in a pinch when you're having leftovers later on. So French onion soup, a really great winter recipe, fairly inexpensive if you don't spend a ton of money on the cheese, and just the perfect soup for these cold winter days when it seems like we're never going to get our hands in the soil and garden again. Let's get started. So here's our 3 pounds of onions. These are homegrown and locally sourced onions. And I'm cutting these as thinly as I can, and I'm going pole to pole. There was a recent episode of the podcast with Kenji and Deb about French onion soup and onions, and they had a big debate about whether do you slice them lengthwise or do you slice them crosswise. If you slice them lengthwise, they're less likely to completely dissolve in the soup. If you slice them crosswise, they're more likely to come completely apart. And Ethan Chabowski, another YouTuber, did a recent deep dive into onions, and he did some blind taste tests, both raw and cooked, and he could barely tell the difference, if at all, between a white onion, a yellow onion, and a red onion. So don't feel like you have to stick to one variety of onion. Use what you have available. Normally in a recipe, I wouldn't put a red onion in there if I wanted it to look aesthetically pleasing, but this is going to caramelize so much that it's not going to make any difference. To this, I'm adding a teaspoon of salt, and I'm covering that, putting it on low, and letting it just simmer for 20 minutes or so. I did not come back and stir this in between. I just left it for 20 minutes, and I had my heat just a little bit too high, and so I did get quite a bit of stickage here on the bottom. I ended up adding a touch of water to kind of loosen some of that up. If your heat is low enough, they should just sweat out most of their liquid, and that's what you're looking for here. And then once these have released all of their liquid, you're just going to cook it down with the lid off, stirring about every 10 minutes for another 40 or 50 minutes. In order to get a really good caramelized onion, you need to really spend some time on this. And so it takes a while. I was doing other jobs in the kitchen, and I just set a timer, and I would come back and stir it every 10 minutes. And this is what you're looking for. You want your onions to be sticky and jammy and nicely caramelized. This is a cup of red wine. I've made this recipe or similar French onion soup recipes with white wine instead of red wine. This is the first time I've done it with red wine. I thought the red wine would complement the beef broth really well. And to be honest, I think I like it with white wine better. So use whatever you feel like. I'm using here 4 cups of homemade beef broth and then another 4 cups of better than bouillon, because I didn't have enough home canned beef broth to do it all with home canned beef broth. So a little bit of both. A teaspoon of dried thyme. You can use fresh if you have it. This was January, so our thyme is definitely hibernating in the winter. And a couple of bay leaves. Give that a good stir. And then you're gonna let this come to a simmer and simmer uncovered for about 30 minutes. You want all of those flavors to meld. You want those bay leaves to give up their flavor, and then taste it for seasoning. You might feel like you need some black pepper in there or another half teaspoon or so of salt. but give it a taste. It's going to depend on how salty your broth was, whether you need more salt. And at this point, the soup itself is ready to go. So just delicious. And then from here, traditionally, you cover your bowls with some toasted bread and then some cheese and then melt everything in the oven so it gets nice and crispy and melty and delicious. One of the recipes for Cooks Illustrated actually makes this as croutons instead of slices of bread, which does make it easier to eat. But honestly, weirdly, I kind of like a big chunk of bread in there where you're kind of working around the bread and it's soaking up all of this soup. So I opted for the whole piece instead of croutons, even though that is a good idea. I actually was making this for some friends coming over for dinner. Forgot to film the original dishing up. So this is a couple of nights later where we're having the leftovers. This is the last 2 servings. This makes about 6 servings total. Another couple pieces of bread in here. And then I had run out of most of the Gruyère cheese. Gruyère is just a fancy way of saying a type of Swiss cheese. And I just bought some sliced Swiss cheese at the grocery store. So nothing fancy on this one. The first batch was better. This is the last of the actual Gruyere that I had bought, which is way more expensive. And then another small handful of Parmesan on here. And you can go as heavy or as light as you want. The original recipe actually also added olive oil to the bread before it was cooked. And I just decided this was rich enough as it was, and I didn't need all those extra calories, so I went a little bit lighter. And because this was just the last 2 servings, I went ahead and cooked this in my toaster oven. And you can throw that back in your oven at 450 until everything gets melty, or if you've got some really good heat-tolerant bowls, you can put it under your broiler and melt and toast everything. But there you go, guys, French onion soup. There is nothing better on a cold winter night. It's inexpensive if you don't use super expensive Gruyere cheese, and just absolutely delicious. Give this recipe a try. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.